evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and answering your questions tonight, Economist and businesswoman Judith Sloan, Parliamentary Secretary for Multicultural Affairs Matt Thistlethwaite, Labor insider turned Sky News commentator Graham Richardson, the author of The Misogyny Factor Anne Summers, and the Shadow Attorney General George Brandis. Please welcome our panel. Thank you, and as usual, we're being simulcast on ABC News 24 and News Radio, and you can join the Twitter conversation with the hashtag that just appeared on your screen. Well, our first question tonight comes from Graham Craig.
My question is to the panel as a whole. Would it not be the height of ruthless self-survival and arrogant disdain of the public's choice if Labor Party now went to Kevin Rudd, who they declared as a failed PM, incapable of getting things done, and then going back to their replacement, who we did not vote for no other reason than self-survival, and therefore, hence, yet again, denying the Australian people the opportunity and their democratic right to appraise a PM's full term at the ballot box?
Graham Richardson.
Oh, thank you very much. Look, this arrogant disdain for the will of the Australian people, it seems to me that the Australian people's will is pretty clear. They want to get rid of Julia Gillard, and they're desperate to. Now, they got pretty angry with Labor for getting rid of Rudd when they wanted to get rid of Rudd themselves. So I'd look upon it as giving them an opportunity to get rid of Rudd again. The one they missed out on 3 years ago. I think that at the moment, I've never seen, never witnessed a hatred for a Prime Minister like I'm seeing now, even among Labor voters. It's appalling, and I think something's got to be done about it. I may be in a minority on that, but that's my view. And I'm not even sure if the Labor Party will do it this week. I just hope so. I have never seen a situation like it. If they don't get rid of Julia Gillard this week, then I fear that the future of the Labor Party itself may well be in danger.
Let me quickly go back to our questioner. Are you saying this because you want the chance to vote Julia Gillard out of office?
Oh, I haven't really decided yet on that. If you'd like me to answer questions, I'll swap with someone on the panel if you like.
No, I was just interested where your question was coming from, that's all.
But this will be the second time that the Labor Party has not given the Australian people the opportunity to give their opinion at the ballot box on a PM's full term.
Yeah, Richo, just address this issue. The big problem with going back to Kevin Rudd is the intense hatred of him in some quarters of the ALP, and I'm wondering, is that unique to the Labor Party?
Look, all I know is whoever emerges on Thursday night as the leader of the Labor Party and the Prime Minister will not lead a united party. That's no longer possible.
Why Thursday night? Why not Friday morning?
Well, it could be Friday morning, but I suspect it'll be Thursday night. That's a suspicion only, because no one knows what's going to happen. So I think it's impossible now to see unity under any circumstance. The hatred for both of them in the caucus is now so great that you can't imagine either of them in any way, shape or form being able to unify the party, which is an awfully sad thing for me to say, but I've never seen division like this. You know, when Hawke and Keating were having their times and troubles, everyone was still talking to each other. It was still a relatively pleasant place to be. There's nothing pleasant about it now.
Anne Summers, reflect if you can on the question, but also what Graham Richardson just said. He's never seen such hatred for a Prime Minister in his time in politics.
Well, I don't know what he's basing that on. All I know is I think if Julia Gillard is bullied out of office by Kevin Rudd and his henchmen, there will be a huge backlash from the public, for both men and women. I think she's far more popular than Graham is giving credit for. And if you look at the polls, the majority of members of the Labor Party, or people who call themselves Labor voters, do not want her removed from office. The people who want the change to Rudd are coalition voters, many of whom I think are just messing with the minds of Labor, and were the change to be made, would not necessarily vote for Rudd. So I think that it would be the worst possible world for Labor to go with somebody on the basis of his supposed popularity in the polls and then to have him go to the election and still lose badly. And quite frankly, I can't see what's in it for Kevin, because he's somebody who wants to be loved. He's not going to like going to an election that he's
someone who likes being Prime Minister, and he'll get at least one more chance to do that.
Well, for a few weeks, but, you know, as Graham says, leading a divided party, he's certainly not going to get the job given to him on a plate by a united party, which apparently is the condition that he is laying down. So he's going to have blood all over his hands, and I quite frankly, can't see what's in it for him.
Judith Sloan.
I mean, to tell you the truth, I've found this incredibly tedious and depressing. I'm kind of quite jealous of my fellow columnists who write about politics because they've been basically able to write the same column for 6 months. Whereas, you know, because...
12.
Yeah, maybe longer, whereas like being an economic commentator, I have to move the topics around. But, you know, the thing is there are some really important issues confronting Australia, some really important policy debates, and it seems to me that's all got shoved to the side. I mean, it's almost like sort of high school, you know, trying to be who's going to be the school captain or something.
Kindergarten, I think.
Oh, kindergarten, okay. It seems to go on and on and on.
If they had news poll in kindergarten, that would be similar, I suppose.
But I agree with Anne in this sense that I don't think we know what, again, being a boring economist, what the transactions costs of the change would be. Okay, those are hypothetical polls. I'm thinking of people who are outside the Beltway who think, now hang on a minute, you knifed him and had to get rid of him, and now you've knifed her to get him back. And I think a lot of people who are not really politically switched on would think that was very strange and think, oh, I couldn't vote for that party.
Matt Thistlethwaite, what do you think?
Well, Julia Gillard led us to the last election. She managed to form a government in what was a very tough election campaign. And Tony Abbott said that this government wouldn't last 3 months. We've lasted 3 years. And in that time, we've undertaken some major nation-building reform. We've priced carbon, something that has been talked about in our economy for many, many decades. Finally, we've got an efficient system that is reducing emissions and is doing in the least cost method available, and ensuring that we transition into a new economy and that we support people to make that transition.
Matt, can I just get you to, you'll get a chance to sort of address some of these policy issues hopefully during the show, but can I just get you to address the fundamental issue raised by the questioner, which is whether Julia Gillard should remain in place in order that the public can judge those 3 years? That was the question.
Well, we've made a decision on the leadership.
But you may be making another one by the end of the week if the commentators of Graham, Richardson and others are correct.
That's a hypothetical, but we've made a decision on the leadership. It was made last year in quite a comprehensive vote for Julia Gillard. There was another go at it earlier in the year. Again, Julia Gillard prevailed. I think we've been a good government that's reformed in the interest of Australia. And I just ask people to think about what's at stake in this coming election. Think about the fact that you're going to be worse off, your kids are going to be worse off at school because the additional funding and resources won't come to the National Plan for School Improvement. Trade training centres that are training apprentices and giving people an opportunity to start their apprenticeship whilst at school, that program will be cut by the opposition.
How do you know
the low-income superannuation, Tony Abbott's already announced it, the low-income superannuation contribution, which is providing tax relief for low-income workers in this country, most of whom are women, will be cut. NBN speeds will be greatly reduced under the coalition.
Matt,
I ask people to think about what's at stake in this election.
I'm just going to interrupt you just for a quick answer to this, because Greg Combet said today there ought to be a spill, pretty much, in order to resolve this issue. Do you agree with him?
That's a hyphypothetical. We've made a decision.
That's not a hypothetical. He said
issue.
There should be a spill.
I think we should continue with our leader, Julia Gillard. She's done a great job, I think an amazing job in the circumstances of a hung parliament to get the reforms through that we've got through.
OK, all right, let's just see. Well, you're sitting next to a former Labor minister. I'll quickly just get his response to that and then we'll go to George Brandis.
I've listened to Anne and to Matt, and all I can say is I sat down with a bloke who used to be my chief of staff earlier on today, and we came up very quickly with a list of 20 really big errors from Julia Gillard. You know, it starts with the carbon tax. There won't be one under a government I lead. Then there's the mining tax. That's the reason you get rid of Kevin Rudd. She's going to raise $10 billion, and what does she raise? $200 million or something. Then there's the surplus. 600 times she and Swan tell everybody there's going to be a surplus. Everyone, Judith and myself, are among millions, are telling them for a year, not possible, but they cling on to it. The mistakes just kept coming. You know, Peter Slipper, she sent the troops in to defend Peter Slipper on the very day that those disgusting texts came out. I mean, I can go on for an hour on this.
Please don't go on for an hour.
I have never seen anyone who makes mistakes at that rate. And it is simply no wonder that the polls are where they are. It's all right to say, oh, the polls don't really count, which is what I'm saying. But they do. They do count. And you have a look at their record on election day, they're right. I don't quite understand how you ignore them now. In my view, the polls give you such overwhelming evidence. 29% primary vote. How low does Labor have to sink? How low can it sink? 29 is just plain pathetic, and we've got to do something about it.
George Brandis. There you go, former Labor minister, pretty much convinced there has to be a change of leadership. Do you think there will be?
Well, I don't know, and really it's not for me to say, but I think what's about as obvious as anything can be from the conversation that we've had so far tonight is that the entire government is a schmozzle. And it's whether it's Gillard or whether it's Rudd, they're both no-hopers. Now, you know, and some have said a little earlier that the caucus shouldn't bully Julia Gillard out of the job. If the caucus replaces Julia Gillard with Kevin Rudd, it won't be because they're bullying her out of the job. It will be because a group of pragmatic Labor politicians have decided that she is such a no-hoper, they've got to get rid of her. But their problem is the only person they can replace her with is the person that 3 years ago they decided was such a no-hoper that they had to put Julia Gillard in place of him. It's a mess, and the country is entitled to better.
Let's go to our next question. It's a video. It's from Keithy Silver in Glen Waverley, Victoria.
Unfortunately, the events of June 2010 have prematurely destroyed the careers of both Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. In contrast, Bill Shorten, a leader of the coup, has made huge gains. Does the panel believe that Bill Shorten owes an explanation to Australians about what motivated him to drive a wedge through a leadership team that had great potential and longevity?
Graham Richardson.
Look, I don't think it's necessarily my job to defend Bill, but he was only one of the people who were involved. I mean, I supported that change, and I was wrong. Julia Gillard was a terrific deputy who couldn't step up. So a lot of us simply made a bad judgment. I think, as my old man used to tell me when I was a kid, if you're wrong, you get out and you get out quick. Unfortunately, in politics, people tend to stay with the wrong decision rather than admit it. It was simply a bad decision.
But going back to the point of the question, I mean, Bill Shorten actually has gone from a junior minister to a kingmaker in a remarkably short space of time.
Give me a break. I mean, that's a great term, kingmaker. I mean, Bill was simply one of a number. You know, is Stephen Conroy or David Feeney or Mark Habib or Don Farrell? There's a whole group of them did it, not just Bill.
No, but I'm talking about the
the
coming week would require him and the votes that he controls
he would
to actually switch to
he would need to
Rudd.
stand up, which he so far hasn't done. And I'm not even certain if he will. There are those who tell me he will. There are those who say he won't. Who knows? But the fact that he's profited from it, as this gentleman suggested, isn't right. I mean, he's profited from the fact that he's pretty bloody good. He should have been a minister in the first place, and he obviously should have been promoted, and he has been.
Very briefly then, because I want to go to the rest of the panel. But
I'm happy if you do.
No, but very briefly on this, what about the idea that was floated over the weekend that actually Julia Gillard might consider stepping aside for Bill Shorten, a third candidate who could emerge and become Prime Minister by the end of the week?
Won't happen. Bill's too smart for that. If he leads now, he destroys his career when he's in his 40s. He'd be crazy, because the slaughter would be pretty much as great as it would be with Julia Gillard. Bill's not well known enough. He's not there yet. He'd need to be opposition leader for a few years and Bill's support. So no, he won't run. He's not that silly.
Matt, does Bill Shorten, as the questioner asked, owe an explanation to the Australian public for getting involved in the first place?
Well, Bill Shorten's an excellent minister. The fact that we've got a national disability insurance scheme through the Parliament is because of Bill's groundwork in this policy area. I've got a relative who's got a profound disability. His mother said that Bill came and consulted with them about a national disability insurance scheme, with the family about what it means. He's done an excellent job, and the fact that we've got that scheme up and running is in no short measure because of his work. In superannuation,
his boss?
he's done I've worked very closely with Bill in superannuation. He's made our superannuation system.
But Matt, I'm going to refocus you. Maybe I'll refocus you with a supplementary question. I mean, has Bill Shorten become the Labor Party's Macbeth? Actually sitting there agonising, privately having soliloquies. Is this a dagger I see before me?
No, I don't believe that. Bill's been a leader within the Labor Party. Bill's been a leader within the Labor Party for a couple of decades, and that comes from his involvement within the Victorian branch, the work that he's done at a local level, his involvement representing workers through his union career, and his good work.
Okay, but I just asked you a very specific question, and that is whether he is actually sitting there agonising over whether to essentially knife Julia Gillard and bring back Kevin Rudd.
I don't know. I haven't spoken to him about that. All I speak to Bill about is policy.
Judith Sloan,
I thought this was
Of course he's agonising over it. That's obvious. As well he should
Matt,
be.
I thought this was Q&A where you're actually expected to answer the question rather than...
I did.
No, you didn't.
Give him a break. This is the worst night possible for a Labor politician to be on Q&A. Give him a break.
So, Judith Sloan.
I mean, I think one of the issues when Kevin Rudd was knifed is that, you know, we kind of believe in a fair go. We've got this raft of unfair dismissal laws, and yet we're actually never told why the guy was knifed. I think that was a really big mistake. So, you know, like, oh, you know, he's gone now. You know, the government, a good government, had lost its way, but we didn't go into any detail why the person who was 1 minute the Prime Minister was no longer the Prime Minister. And I think they paid a very heavy price for that. I think in retrospect it was a mistake rushing to the election. I think, you know, ultimately a lot of this stuff is about how public judges characters. And all of us were very puzzled about what was going on. We hadn't realised that a lot of them thought that Kevin Rudd was a psychopath. We were told that, what, 12 months later, you know?
We certainly were told subsequently, and I think at the time that he was knifed, if you want to use that language, his standing in the polls was declining. It was feared that he was going to take Labor to a massive defeat. So it was, you know, that was a poll-driven action. But I think what's very significant about what happened that night is that, you know, he and Julia Gillard had a conversation. He was going to contest his position the next morning, but then decided not to because he had clearly had. Overwhelmingly, Julia Gillard was the one who was going to be supported by caucus, so he certainly did not have any support.
And
so
the question, I was going to bring you back to the Bill Shorten issue. The question was about Bill Shorten and his role in all of this. Very briefly, what do you think about Shorten's role? Because he's evidently sitting there, as Graham Richardson says, sitting there agonising over this huge decision he must make during the week.
So I read. I don't really know. I don't have access to what Bill's thinking or what he's doing. I understand that he only controls, 6 or 7 votes. So that makes him a fairly, limited kingmaker, I would have thought. But I have no idea what he's going to do. But I think, the fact that Kevin Rudd was unpopular with his colleagues may not have been spelled out in detail at the time, but it was certainly very clear to all of us that he was massively deficient, the government was not working, he was incapable of making decisions, and the reason that Julia Gillard was so popular was that she was very good at it.
George Brandis.
What happened?
Well, she still made a huge number of very good decisions, Graham. I think you're, looking at a glass totally empty situation instead of.
I am.
Yeah, well, I think that's wrong.
I am.
Well, look, Tony, you bring Bill Shorten's name into the mix, but it doesn't matter how many names you bring into the mix. It's the same old circus. And that's the problem. They are totally divided, as Richo has said. And you mentioned Macbeth before. It is a bit like a play, but it's not a high tragedy, it's a low farce. And there are no heroes, there are only villains. That's the problem with the Labor Party. When Graham Richardson, who's got more political experience than anyone on this panel and knows the Labor Party better than anyone, says that I have never seen a political party more divided in my life. That's a chilling thing to say about the party that is meant to be governing the country.
OK, let's go to our next question. It's from... Thank you. It's from Therese Cornish.
Corkish, but...
Corkish, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, my question is for Anne Summers. We've seen a couple of horrible weeks for women in Australia, and it's set to become a lot worse under Tony Abbott. we've seen our elected representative of Australia lambasted by the media and by the public. What reason can you give me as a young woman who wants to create change, a reason to subject myself to that sort of thing? I once wanted to be the first female Prime Minister of Australia, but now I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Why should I even care or even consider doing that in a climate like this?
Well, I think that's a very fair and very sad question, because it's too late for you to be the first female Prime Minister, but perhaps you could be the second or the third. And I would certainly encourage you to pursue a career in politics if that's what you want to do. But what's been very apparent from the way Julia Gillard has been treated by the opposition, by parts of the media, large parts of the media, by many people in the population, and increasingly recently by her own caucus colleagues, some of whom openly mock her, is that being the first woman Prime Minister of this country has brought out some pretty unpalatable forms of behaviour in the Australian population. And I know I, for one, I thought getting our first female Prime Minister was such a great accomplishment. OK, tick, we've done that, we can sort of move on. It turned out, though, that the Australian people, or very large sections of them, simply aren't ready for it, can't cope with it, and are reacting to it very badly, expressing hostility of a highly sexual nature in many instances, which has been quite repugnant, I'm sure, to many of us. And I think it's been very difficult for Gillard herself, because, as she has said, she initially put up with it and didn't complain because she didn't want women like you, young women like you, to be discouraged. But it got to the point where she had to call it. And one of the things that's really annoying me at the moment is that every time she tries to defend women, she's accused of playing the so-called gender card, which is a ridiculous way of characterising somebody standing up for their own rights. And it's got to the situation now where last Saturday, when I think the Attorney-General and Bill Shorten and another minister announced an inquiry under the Sex Discrimination Act into discrimination against pregnant women in the workforce and women returning to work after maternity leave. Notorious women being sacked for being pregnant, being discriminated against and downgraded when they return from maternity leave. This was branded a gender inquiry by the media, rather than a quite legitimate inquiry into discrimination under the Sex Discrimination Act. So I think there's been a huge amount of unfairness directed at her and against women generally.
Do you think, Anne, though, that one of the reasons that may have happened is because Julia Gillard did play the gender card? I mean, she's the one who gave the ridiculous speech 2 weeks ago about men in blue ties. She is the one who, including me, I'm wearing my blue tie very proudly tonight. Blue is the colour of freedom, after all. It was Julia Gillard who last Wednesday night at the Parliamentary ball spoke in her speech very proudly about the gender wars. She is the one who's amped up the rhetoric.
Well,
OK, I'm just going to interrupt you because, our questioner's got a hand up. And actually, while you've got your hand up, can I just ask you, because you made a contestable point during your question, which is that things would get worse for women under a Tony Abbott government. Briefly, why do you say that?
We know from his attitudes toward women, his casual throwaway comments like when a housewife does the ironing and things like that, that his attitudes towards women aren't really what we need in 21st century Australia.
OK, I'm just going to quickly go back to Anne on this. I mean, here we've got Tony Abbott. He's got feisty young daughters. He's got a tough wife. He's got a female chief of staff. He's got a female deputy. What makes you say that he can't get on with women, or that things will get worse for women?
Well, I didn't say that.
Do you agree with that point?
Well, what we do know, what's demonstrable, is the fact that there will be 50% fewer women in cabinet if Tony Abbott were to win the election, because he only has 2 women in his cabinet, whereas there currently are 4. The numbers of women in the whole leadership team of the Liberal Party is much less. There's only 19% women in the Liberal Party compared with 38% of women in the Labor Party. It's unfortunate the Liberals don't encourage women more into their party. Also, the Deputy Prime Minister will be...
So with the influx of new candidates, they might win with a landslide election. You might see a lot more
women.
Well,
that's what happened with John Howard in 1996. Record numbers of women came in, but they didn't last.
I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but we've got another question on this subject, and I want to hear from the rest of the panel too. So let's go to Elliot Nimmo.
Hi, Tony. My question is to Anne Summers, and it's regarding misogyny. As a progressive and reasonable male individual, I find Julia Gillard's blue tie diatribe not only offensive, but rather ill-sighted. I would suggest that she and her female colleagues are only broadening the divide between women and men by these comments. What do you think?
Before I go to Anne, I want to hear from other panellists. So Judith Sloan, start.
Well, I would make the point, Anne, that there seems a bit of hypocrisy in Julia Gillard's position in terms of playing the gender card, that she can't bring herself to support a female candidate in the seat of Batman. There, you know, you have a classic example, a safe seat. You're going to violate the rule of 40%.
I'm not going to disagree with you.
You know, well, the thing is, you have to, you know, walk the talk. Otherwise, people could be very suspicious that you're basically playing this card for political purposes. And I think what we...
Why else would you play it?
Well, because you actually genuinely believe it.
I think there's no doubt about that.
I disagree with you, Anne. I think it's absolute rubbish, and I think it's rubbish, the idea that somehow it's going to be worse for women under Tony Abbott. I think that's just sort of a rhetorical flourish that has no meaning. I think the point is that, I mean, you say that, you know, there were complaints about the Human Rights Commission inquiry being brought on. Why now? I mean, and why now? I mean, this has been an issue for a long time, has it not? So it... And the final point...
And I say about time.
Yeah, but,
and I'm glad
you know,
they've done
they've
it.
been in power for 6 years. If this was such an important issue, why not 6 years ago? I would also make the point that I think we tend to forget how vicious the comments were about John Howard. I mean...
And Alexander Downer.
They were vicious. I mean, he was a war criminal, he was having affairs, he had a rat follow him around, we had the Not Happy John group. It was very vicious, and the thing
Actually,
is...
I think that George Brandis had something to do with the rat, didn't he? I seem to remember...
No, Tony.
Didn't you make the rodent comment?
Would you like me to intervene in the discussion at this point?
I would.
Can I just make an observation to the young lady who asked the question before? I think I can claim to know Tony Abbott better than anyone else on the panel. And I can absolutely assure you that if you knew him, you would not believe the remark you made. This is a person whose every significant person in their life, other than his father, is a woman. His wife, his daughters, his mother, his chief of staff, most of his senior staff, his deputy leader. This is a man who, more than anyone I can think of in politics, is surrounded by strong women. And as somebody who knows him and works with him on a daily basis, and I say this with all due respect, the caricature that you are regurgitating about Tony Abbott is dead wrong. And might I say, if you want a strong female...
Well, you could actually say, to be fair, it may be out of date because he may have changed his attitudes from many years ago.
No, I've known him for many years. Dead wrong.
But there are all these statements on the record.
And if you want a role model for a strong female Prime Minister who was strong and competent and who didn't need to play the gender card, then what about Margaret Thatcher?
Can I respond? Yeah. Matt, I'll go to Matt Thistlethwaite, and the original question was about playing the gender card.
And I was asked a question about the blue ties.
Yes, you can come back to that.
To Therese, don't lose hope, because we do need more good young women in Parliament and in leadership in positions. But look, despite all the progress that we've made on gender issues and on women's rights, I think it's fair to say that we've still got a lot further to go. And we need champions for that cause, like young women like yourself, people like Anne Summers, people like Julia Gillard, who spent most of her career, and Judith on occasions.
Okay, Matt, I'm going to
Julia Gillard has spent most of her career advancing the rights of women. And I imagine that for someone who's been a champion for women's rights for her whole career, having to stomach comments from Tony Abbott, such as his approach on RU486, such as his views on abortion, would be deeply offensive. Deeply offensive. And that's the reasons behind the comments that have been made by the Prime Minister.
OK, Graham Richardson,
I'm
you
not
can
sure what
reflect
that's
on
got to do
both
with blue ties. I thought the blue tie speech was a disgrace for two reasons. One, it was just rambling, and it really didn't have a purpose.
Have you read it?
It did seem to be scripted. It was worse than rambling because it was scripted.
It was all very weird. I mean, the Prime Minister's office wouldn't allow journalists into the room, and yet they then apparently filmed it, edited it, and then released it. if I'd been editing it, the blue tie stuff would have gone out, as would abortion, which I think raised an issue that's very divisive and hasn't been divisive in Australia for the best part of a decade. No one's really talked about it in a long time. So I was disappointed that got re-raised. Pardon?
It's been all about men before that. Nobody's listened to a woman about
No,
it.
but wait a minute. If abortion had been an issue, you would have been raising it, and Summers certainly would have been raising it. We'd have
And
been
I
reading
have
about
been,
it over
Graham,
the last
and
decade.
I have been.
But we haven't been. It's not. I just haven't noticed it, Anne. If it's
Okay.
been on the front page of the papers and it's been on television and radio, I missed it.
Okay, Anne Summers.
Actually,
we'll go back to our questioner because Elliot, because you still haven't had a chance to answer that. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it infuriates me so much to have, whether you're going off at Tony Abbott or Julia Gillard on the basis of sex, you should look at their track record. And for example, Anna Bligh, Christina Keneally, the Premier Kroner, these women, coincidentally, who are women, have appalling track records. And now you have someone like Gillard. So they're being criticised on their track record, not on their gender. And I think it's an absolute... It makes a farce, bringing in this gender thing. It's not even a debate. It shouldn't be, because it's the 21st century Australia.
I'd like to think that it wasn't, but unfortunately it has been, and it's been amply documented, the ways in which Gillard in particular, but also and certainly Anna Bligh and some of the other women you mentioned, have been sexually attacked and vilified during their terms in office. I mean, it's a very unfortunate, sad...
You mean attacked on the basis of their sex rather than sexual attack?
No,
I actually don't mean as a joke.
No, I don't mean whether they're gay or not so much. Though Gillard has to cop that. I mean, either she's a lesbian or a homewrecker, covering all bases. But she gets attacked on all fronts. And then the whole point about that Howard Sattler question, the way I heard it was, is your boyfriend gay? Was code for, really, is he a handbag? Are you gay? That was what that was all about. But
you're not going down the Howard Sattler path yourself by raising this into discussion.
I'm not. But what I would like to come back to is the question of abortion, because Graham said that it was a mistake to raise that issue, that it's something that hasn't been raised in this country for a long time. I completely disagree with that. And I think Julia Gillard had a very significant political victory last week or the week before, which has been completely overlooked by other commentators, and that was when she made that reference to not wanting Australia to become a place where abortion once again became the political plaything of men. What she was referring to the way I heard it, was we didn't want to go back to a situation where if the coalition is returned to power and Tony Abbott is Prime Minister and does not control the Senate, that you have the DLP Senator John Madigan using the balance of power to negotiate changes to abortion entitlements, for example, a Medicare rebate for abortion,
Abbott has ruled that out, absolutely.
Well, as a result of Gillard's intervention.
Not as a result.
Yes.
Gillard raised a false issue. Gillard raised an entirely phony issue, and Abbott...
That he then responded to and ruled out. They said he wouldn't deal. This is great. He has said he will not let John Madigan be his Brian Harity.
Because this phony argument was raised.
It wasn't phony.
Listen, it was a phony argument was raised. Abbott had...
What was phony about it?
Because it was a straw man argument. There was nothing.
So why did he respond to it?
As Graham Richardson and Judith Sloan have pointed out, abortion has not been in issue in this country for more than a decade. The first politician of the current crop of politicians to put it back on the table was Julia Gillard.
Well, that's just nonsense. It's complete nonsense. She raised it in this context, and he and Tony Abbott immediately said, OK, I will not do what you're worried about.
Tony Abbott said, you are misrepresenting my position. Let me tell you how you're misrepresenting my position.
This is great.
So it's kind of a self-justifying lie.
He has now ruled out something that a lot of us were very concerned could happen.
OK, I'm going to move on. We've got another question. It's a video. It's from Ted Maguire in Cashmere in Queensland.
Hi, panel. Hi, punters. Calling an election 8 months out has been a recipe for much domestic hardship. Small businesses know that once an election's called, everything just stalls until there's a result. Please put the country first and allow whichever bunch of red, blue or green wannabes a crack at getting the country going again. As a small business owner, seeing some of the worst economic times in 35 years, why oh why can't the government go to the election now? Please, can we just get on with it?
Judith Sloan, Let's quickly go to the premise of that question, that small business suffered because an election was called early. And I guess he's talking about a period of uncertainty. Is there any economic truth to that?
Yes, there is, in the sense that a lot of investment decisions are put on hold. I mean, I guess, you know, there was a view that the election would be around this time, but I think the broader point is this, that this government and the business community, the relationship has completely broken down. And there is, I think, a tremendous amount of uncertainty. They feel very burdened by a lot of regulation. If you look at the business sentiment survey, it's been absolutely terrible. Consumer sentiment a little bit better, but still pretty terrible. So I think this government has completely failed to understand the important role of business, particularly small business, and they've basically made things so much worse. And therefore, the fact that we've had this sort of faux extended election campaign has made life very difficult for a lot of business.
OK, we'll address the, I'm going to address the part of the question, please, can we get on with it? And we don't normally make a point of asking the audience questions. We'll make an exception tonight. Please put your hand up if you believe the Labor Party should change leaders this week. Please put your hand up if you believe the Labor Party should change leaders. OK, that's a relatively small section of the audience. The second question, put your hand up if you think the country should go immediately to an election if there is a leadership change. Pretty much everybody thinks they should. OK, Graham Richardson.
I agree with that too.
You agree with that too?
Yep.
Tell us why.
But Graham, this audience doesn't seem to reflect your view of this immense hatred of the Prime Minister.
No,
Yes, are you surprised by that to start with?
There are more haters in the Labor Party than there are in the Q&A audience.
It doesn't reflect any of the polls that are coming out either. And that's okay. I mean, it's an ABC audience and it's got a right to its own view. This is a democracy.
I'll just make this point. The polls aren't saying change leaders. They're actually saying change government.
Well, of course they are, and they're calling for an election as well. And I believe that if Kevin Rudd does become the Prime Minister into this week, that he should call an election immediately. I do not believe that we should go on the way we are. I think it was a dreadful mistake to announce an election in February for September. I think it was a really bad decision. And I think that there should be an election. There should be one now. And so,
OK, let's just let me put you on the spot. If Kevin Rudd did become the leader and called an immediate election, is there anything at all he could do to change the national conversation? I mean, could he say, "I'll stop the boats"? Could he say, "I'll immediately bring an emissions trading scheme in"? Is there anything he could do to change the?
I don't think anyone can stop the boats, so I'm not going to say that he can. I don't believe that he can or Scott Morrison can, but I do believe that he could do something about the carbon price, which has been absurd. I mean, starting at $23 and then all those ridiculous predictions of 29 that they've had to correct, that's just been dumb. And it's looked dumb the whole time through. Yeah, he could fix that. I think there's, you wouldn't know what he's about to do. You'd have to announce a program. I hope to God he's been thinking about it for the last couple of years and he's got one. But there's so many things you could do. Let's just hope he starts it.
OK.
Well, but this is your preferred candidate for Prime Minister, Richo, and the best you can do is, I hope to God he's got one.
Well, come on. Mate, all I know is the current one doesn't have one, so there's a better chance with the new one.
Well, that fills us with confidence.
George, let's just go back to the reaction we just got from the audience there. And it may be reflective of the fact that there's a lot of coalition voters in the audience and they actually don't want a change of leadership.
Don't think so. Well, as Richo says, it's an ABC audience. It has its own views.
Well, it's an ABC audience, you might say that, but there's an awful lot of coalition voters in this audience.
There are a lot of coalition voters in the country at the moment.
Touché. And Summers, just a quick sort of reflection on this idea of getting it all over with. I mean, there does seem to be an overwhelming idea, as reflected in that video question and in the audience. They want this over and done with. They're basically sick of it.
Well, the whole thing about announcing the election earlier this year, I mean, at the time, a lot of people thought that was a really good idea because what we would have had otherwise would have been every time anyone breathed, there would be speculation about whether or not, she would call an election. And so what she did by announcing that it's, 8 months hence was to remove that uncertainty at least and to... I thought, and a lot of people thought at the time, that this was a way of actually introducing some certainty for business and for other people. If it's not seen that way now, well, OK, you can't win, I guess, when it comes to these things.
Okay, well, let's change subjects and we'll move on to our next question, which is from Daniel Boland.
My question's for Judith Sloan. Yesterday in a blog post, you referred to childcare workers as dim-witted graduates from second-rate universities. How can we ever hope to reform or improve the childcare industry if this is the level of respect afforded to its employees?
It was a blog, you know, so colourful language is required. But let me make a serious point. The childcare reforms have not worked. There's really very considerable disarray in the childcare sector. The fees have gone up incredibly. It's not uncommon in Sydney for daily fees to be, you know, $100, $120 a day. The rebate is frozen and is frozen actually for a few years into the future.
Judith, I think you just addressed a politician earlier and said they should come to the question. Now, that question was about what you wrote about childcare workers, dim-witted people from second-rate universities. If that's true, can you justify what you said?
Well, I was objecting to the regulation that says a childcare centre must have a university graduate. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. If parents want a centre with a university graduate, that's fine. The idea that you would roll out a national regulation which says that you must have a university graduate, be it from a first-rate, second-rate or third-rate university, I think is very mistaken regulation. It's pushing up costs, and what we need is a much more diverse, competitive childcare sector.
OK, but once again, I'll bring you to the point. What makes you say that childcare workers who are trained at university are dim-witted?
I was just making the point in some of my personal experiences. I've found, let me put it, they lack a certain amount of common sense in terms of how they treat toddlers.
Matt Thistlethwaite.
Well, I completely disagree with Judith. It's a great question, Daniel. And the objective facts refute what Judith has said. There's more kids in childcare in Australia than ever before. For the first time, we've hit 1 million kids in childcare in this country. Childcare has been more affordable than ever before because we introduced the childcare rebate. We pushed it up from 30% to 50%. And the proportion that households are spending on childcare has been falling. We've introduced these new conditions to improve standards. I've got a couple of kids in childcare and I can tell you that the workers that look after my kids work damn hard. Damn hard. And I believe that they deserve to be paid more. That's why the Gillard government's devoted more funding to boosting the pay of childcare workers. It's about better standards, better results and, importantly, a better education for our kids.
All right, we're starting to run out of time. I'd like to get some more questions in and we'll go to Alistair Laurie.
My question's to Senator Brandis. Last Tuesday, you announced that the Coalition would block any LGBTI anti-discrimination bill that did not allow religious aged care service providers to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. This is despite the fact that these agencies themselves do not believe they need this exception. You seem to be putting a theoretical religious freedom above practical protections. Why don't you believe that older lesbians, gay men, bisexuals and transgender Australians, people who have grown up when their love was criminalised, who lost friends and lovers to HIV and AIDS, have the right to grow old in dignity and respect that they deserve?
It's a very important question that you ask, and let me explain what the opposition's position is. But there was one statement in your question which wasn't quite right. You said that the religious institutions, the churches, didn't themselves want the exemption so far as concerned aged care facilities. That's not right. Some said they didn't want it. Most said they did. So don't be misled by a misleading statement by the Attorney-General. On the broader issue, when the bill, the sex discrimination bill, was introduced into the Parliament, I took a submission to the Shadow Cabinet and to our party room, which was, I think without a dissenting voice, endorsed that we should support it. And the reason we support it is because it's actually the policy we took to to the 2010 election that the provisions of the Sex Discrimination Act should extend to sexuality as a protected attribute. The government knew that they had the opposition on board with this. In fact, the government's measure was itself taken from the opposition's report on the broader Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Bill, the bill that was abandoned by the government earlier this year because it was acknowledged to have gone way too far. So we had, on this very tricky and important issue of discrimination against gay people, we had bipartisanship and unanimity. And then into the middle of this harmonious bipartisan moment, the Labor Party, out of the blue, threw in an amendment, never anticipated, never expected, that would have caused the religious exemption issue to come into play. Now, if you want to build a consensus around this issue, that gay people should be protected from discrimination by the Sex Discrimination Act, then you would not have done that. And the Labor Party, on all other grounds, in all other arenas, has said that it will respect the religious exemption. I'm cynical about why the Labor Party did that, knowing that by introducing the religious exemption, it would make it impossible for that bipartisanship to continue.
George Brandis, the questioner's got his hand up, so we'll go back to you.
I'd just like to pick up a point that you seem to be making. In Senator Humphrey's dissenting report to the Sex Discrimination Senate inquiry, the two organisations that he quoted justifying the call for a religious exception in that circumstance were the Australian Christian Lobby and the Catholic Women's League. Neither of them provide religious aged care services. So in that circumstance, why are we trying to impose a religious exception to the detriment of older LGBT people for those groups that don't actually run those services?
Well, I'm very familiar with that minority report because I was one of the signatories to it and I had a lot to do with drafting it. There were many more submissions to the inquiry from other churches and religious institutions than those two. So don't infer that because those two were mentioned as a for example, those were the only ones, because they weren't.
OK, George, I'd like to hear other people on this subject. Anne Summers?
I'm afraid I don't know much about the legislation. I mean, I just obviously would support the principle that LGBT people should be able to go to retirement homes and nursing homes free from any form of discrimination, which I take to be the central point. And I know that one of the problems with homes that are run by some religions is that they have been discriminatory in the past, and I imagine what we're trying to avoid is the continuation of that discrimination, and I would support that.
Yeah, very briefly, George, before I go back to the other panellists, shouldn't anti-discrimination be universal?
No.
Why?
No.
Shouldn't.
Anti-discrimination law should not be universal because the right to fair treatment is one of several very important but sometimes inconsistent values. The right of people who practice or profess a particular religious faith to live their lives and to conduct their institutions in accordance with the precepts of their religious faith is integral to religious freedom. And religious freedom is also a fundamentally important value. And it's
but just on principle, you're saying that religious freedom supersedes the freedom of your sexuality?
Yes, I am, as a matter of fact. Yes, I am. But I'm also making a political point. We in the Liberal Party have joined with people in the Labor Party to progress this agenda for years. And those who wanted to see the Sex Discrimination Act extend to protect people on the grounds of their sexuality were furious that the Labor Party decided to throw in a curveball into this debate that deprived the country of the opportunity for unanimity on this. OK,
let's hear from the government. Matt, Thistlethwaite, did you throw a curveball in order to create a problem for the coalition supporting your legislation?
No, I think it's a bit of a cop-out for George to seek to blame the government for their position on this. The reason why we've developed that position is in response to the concerns of people such as yourself within the community. And I think in this day and age, in a secular society, the view that's been put forward by the Labor Party reflects the views of the community. That's why we've done it. I think that's good legislating, and it's a bit of a cop-out for the opposition to blame us for that.
Matt, the legislation that you introduced into the Parliament didn't have that provision in it. The legislation that was called for by your senators didn't call for that provision. It came out of the blue after it was established that this bill had bipartisan support. Why did you do it?
It came out of consultation, George.
No, it came out of... No, it came out of the blue.
I wasn't involved in...
No, you weren't.
I wasn't involved directly in it, but
it came out of the blue.
In my consultations with Labor Party senators, it came out of consultation.
Okay.
It came out of the views of the public.
All right, I think we'll move on. Our last question tonight, we are running out of time, is a video. It comes from Joanna Eggart in Darwin.
Recently, Nigella Lawson was allegedly verbally threatened and physically assaulted by her wealthy husband in a restaurant full of other rich and powerful people, and no one did anything. Do we really not want to be involved? Do we lack courage? Or is it just that women these days, no matter how well known or how significant their contribution, are still less valued, therefore not worth fighting for? Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Anne Summers.
Well, I thought it was absolutely shocking what happened. The fact that Charles Saatchi would attack her at all, that he would attack her in public, that she was clearly frozen in terror watching the video of it, that nobody went to her aid, that nobody went up and tried to grab his hands and take them away from her neck, the fact that she apparently has been so cowed since. She's so worried about being seen as a victim that she doesn't want to speak out publicly about it. And I think this is such a shocking thing that women are the ones who feel victimised when they in fact have been subjected to attacks. I mean, the same thing happens in the political arena. When you stand up for yourself, you get accused of playing the gender card. It's just completely wrong.
Would you really expect patrons of a posh restaurant in Sydney or Melbourne to intervene in a domestic dispute?
I would, yes. I would. Just as, we've had a debate in this country recently about there have been people who've been racially abused on public transport many times in different... And a big discussion about what would you do if you saw somebody yelling at, say, an Asian person on the train. Would you intervene and risk even perhaps being attacked yourself? And it's a question that we all probably don't know how would react to. We're actually in the situation, but you'd like to think that you would do something, you would go to the fence of the person being attacked.
Graham
and
Richardson?
the fact that nobody went to Nigella's aid, I think, is just unbelievable.
Well, look, I agree with Anne. I think this guy's just a total grub. And I think if you...
I think we'd have to say allegedly.
No, we don't. No, he is a total grub. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm really ashamed for all of those people in the restaurant, male and female, who did not intervene. When you saw how bad it was, I can't... Look, I'm no hero and I'm physically not very imposing, but I'd like to think I'd get up and scream at the bloke at least. You'd have to have a go, and no one did.
Judith Sloan.
Yes, I mean, I think most people's reaction would be to, at an absolute minimum, to say, are you all right? Do you want some help?
I don't know what it tells us about society that someone actually took photographs of it but didn't intervene and sold the photographs to the newspaper.
We've seen that in other
We've got a questioner down the front here who just threw his hand up.
Yeah. Just the thing, not so much a question, but when people see other people getting into an argument of some sort and it's getting physical or violent, or even if somebody's just breaking rules or whatever, in the old days, you might have walked over and said, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. But nowadays, if you go up and question somebody about their right to do something or say you shouldn't be doing that, they might take exception and they'll attack you. It's like it's their right to do as they see fit. And it's like their right to do anything, even if it's an offence to the law. That's ahead of everything. So it's basically stay out of the way unless you want to end up with retribution. Someone's going to get you if you're not careful.
George Brandis.
Well, I think that you make a fair point, sir, but equally, I think it's difficult to be too prescriptive about a particular incident without being acquainted with all of the facts. Ordinarily, I basically agree with what Judith Sloan said. Depending on the intensity of the incident, you'd expect ordinary human beings to go along and say to the person, are you all right? But there has been, I think, the development in society, and it's a bad thing, of a culture of sort of walking on by. And the point this gentleman makes, I think, is reflective of, more reflective of the development or the way in which society is developing than Judith Sloan's attitude.
Matt?
Well, I think it unfortunately demonstrates that we've got some way to go in changing culture in respect of this issue. But I agree with Graham. I think that, that particular circumstance was shocking, and blokes have got to stand up and say, no, that's not acceptable. And I would like to think in a circumstance like that, that if you did something like that, other patrons in the restaurant would back you up, and indeed the management within the restaurant would say, no, that's not acceptable on our premises.
I'll just go back to Anne Summers. In a way, this is your field, but I mean, the fact that this was a very famous person, we've got someone with their hand, we've got a few people with their hands up there, so we'll get a microphone to that young lady in the middle there. But the fact that this is a very famous person has made it 10 times more shocking, I suppose, for the general public. But these sort of things go on all the time.
Well, yeah, I mean, the rate of domestic violence and other forms of violence in our society are very extensive and appear to be increasing. I mean, this is certainly what the police say. The thing that's really alarming, and we've had a lot of discussion in the last week about the sentencing for, the murder of Jill Maher in Melbourne, is that the rate of conviction appears to be going down, the level of sentencing appears to be going down, people seem to be getting out on parole sooner than they were, sooner than perhaps they should be. I think the whole issue about violence in our society, and particularly violence against women, is something that we just, are barely scratching the surface on, and we need to do a lot more. And when it is somebody famous, such as Nigella Lawson, we can scarcely believe it because we have this stereotype that it only happens to, certain people in certain suburbs, and that simply isn't the case.
I'll just quickly go down to that young lady who had her hand up patiently on the floor there. Go ahead.
So more a comment, but just when General Morrison spoke last week about misogyny in the military, he said the standard you walk past is the standard that you accept. Just when we're thinking about things like domestic violence, I think that could be something we could think about more and extend beyond the military.
I think we'll leave it on that comment. Thank you very much for that. That is all we have time for. Please thank our panel, Judith Sloan, Matt Thistlethwaite, Graham Richardson, Anne Summers and George Brandis. Thank you. Well, with politics on a knife edge, there's plenty to talk about. So next week we'll have 2 Q&As. On Monday, we'll examine the wash-up of events or non-events in Canberra with spin meisters and advertising gurus Todd Sampson, Sue Cato and Neil Lawrence, and political players Sophie Mirabella and someone yet to be confirmed from Labor.
It's the same old story.
We'll just wait and see who's the leader by then. Q&A will then present its first ever edition from foreign soil on Thursday, July 4. The Prime Minister will arrive in Indonesia to meet with President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. And Q&A will also be there, bringing together a panel of leading thinkers to face an audience of Indonesian and Australian citizens in Jakarta and discussing the future of our most important regional relationship. So join us for Q&A next Monday night as usual, and then again Q&A Jakarta on Thursday night at 9:30 p.m. Until next week, good night.